This video is brought to you by Metagalaxia Entertainment.
Out of all planetary bodies in the solar system, Mars is the one humanity has sought to colonize the most. Its proximity in relation to the Earth, as well as to the Sun, make it a perfect candidate for setting up camp. On July 20th, 1976, humanity's first successful attempt at a Mars lander was the Viking 1. Since then, there have been 10 more non-satellite missions, 6 of which have successfully transmitted data, and 2 of which are still operational. Launching any mission to Mars is wildly expensive and has historically had about a 50% success rate. However, this has proved to be no roadblock, as missions are still being put into effect. SpaceX plans to launch their first mission to Mars as soon as 2022, and NASA's next mission is scheduled for 2020. Since the late 50s, and especially 60s, being ahead in the space race was a way to show off technological prowess, and it created a sense of nationalistic pride. Along with important research that can be obtained from sending humans to Mars, notoriety is a huge factor that drives the ambition for certain organizations to send successful manned missions to the Red Planet. The colonization of Mars is not only an attractive goal, it may also be a necessary one. Within the span of a lifetime, the probability of an asteroid within the size range of 1 to 10 kilometers in diameter to collide with Earth is estimated to be about 1 in 10,000. Looking only at our immediate future, the probability of such a collision makes it nothing to be frightened about. On an astronomical timeline, however, impacts are quite frequent. If we expect humanity to survive well into the future, it would be best to prepare for a disaster of such scale by first colonizing other planets in our solar system, and then possibly the local group of stars. The reason being, the survival of our species would only be assured at that point. It is possible that before we colonize, we could obtain technology great enough to destroy an asteroid that would be a threat to humanity, bypassing that issue entirely. That is a fairly unsafe assumption, however, which could cause us to underestimate the imminence of the possible threat. Many of us did think flying cars would be commonplace by the year 2015 after all, which just hasn't happened. Either way, in the long run, it would be worthwhile anyway to expand outward into space, solving any potential population crisis. A colony of Mars would facilitate how we acquire heavy metals such as cobalt, iron, platinum, nickel, and other resources through asteroid mining, by acting as a hub that sorts and organizes raw materials before they're sent back to Earth. By facilitating our ability to mine asteroids, access to a virtually unlimited supply of materials such as coltan, an invaluable material in manufacturing computer hardware, would benefit the information and technology industry and further increase our ability to create more advanced computers. When it comes to living there, the needs of a settlement on Mars are very different than an experimental habitat on Earth. It needs to be airtight, with its own independent carbon dioxide and oxygen cycle, along with a nitrogen cycle, as keeping soil fertile is as important as selecting the proper plants. There also needs to be a balanced water supply and food production, as well as a waste management system. This artificial habitat is known as a biosphere, a concept that has been studied and put into practice for the past 3 decades now. A biosphere is essentially any environment which can support life. There have been many social studies done by organizations such as HiSeas, which alone has done 6 studies ranging from 4 to 12 months in length since April 2013. Their operation is in a habitat about 13,000 cubic feet and has 1,200 square feet of floor space. Up to 6 people share the space, but they are allowed to venture out to explore the terrain or get samples. They do wear equipment similar to what astronauts wear once they step outside though. They are also isolated from the rest of humanity, being at least an hour away from any emergency support. A 20-minute communication delay is also put in place to mimic the time it takes for a signal to get from Mars to Earth. I won't be covering the HiSeas projects in too much depth, however, due to their focus being mainly on the social aspect and less on terraforming. Perhaps the best example of an artificial biosphere is the experiment known as Biosphere 2. The experiment was intended to test a sustainable way to support life on Mars, taking into account all the implications of survival. The project area was about 135,000 square feet, roughly 100 times larger than the site used by HiSeas. To put it into perspective, the HiSeas site is about the size of this house, and Biosphere 2 is the size of the area within this blue line. Beginning in June 16, 1994, after the crew of 4 men and 4 women waved their final goodbyes to the public, they were enclosed in the 3.15-acre space with no supplies to be delivered from the outside for 2 years. While the crew was inside, they went on record as being constantly hungry. There were reports of medical data on the 8 subjects comparing pre-closure data with data after 6 months of closure. Significant changes included men's average weight going from 74 to 62 kilograms, while women's average went from 61 to 54. According to a study, 85% of all food eaten was grown within Biosphere 2 during the 2 years of closure, and 15% was from food grown there before closure and stored before September 21, 1991. This level of consumption of food was maintained while physical activity was constant, which included manual farming, maintenance of Biosphere 2, collection of scientific data, and day-to-day activities. Exercise also needs to be taken into account when considering the lifestyle of a colonial of Mars. The average astronaut aboard the International Space Station needs approximately 2 hours of exercise a day to prevent muscle and bone decay. On the surface of Mars, the gravity acting on you is only 38% of the gravity of Earth. Assuming the relationship of exercise needed is direct, this formula can be used to calculate exercise time. This means, taking into account the gravity difference between an astronaut on the ISS, a human on Mars would likely need to exercise a minimum of 1.24 hours a day. The total energy expenditure would be far greater than the experimental value taken from Biosphere 2. This would result in a slightly larger area needed per person for food, and a greater intake of oxygen, thus increasing the 0.4-acre area per individual value in Biosphere 2. Records indicate the oxygen in Biosphere 2 decreased during the first 16 months of closure, from the ambient 21% to 14%, enough to cause health problems in the occupants. The difference was so drastic that fresh oxygen had to be pumped inside the habitat to keep the participants from feeling fatigued, experiencing confusion, and losing consciousness. The habitat on Mars, however, won't have the luxury of access to immediate emergency aid. As is the case with all astronauts, agreements can be signed accepting risk and preventing possible legal action from being taken against companies, such as SpaceX, in the case of an accident, either regarding rocket failures or system failure after landing. With the larger scale of a colonization project, however, should an issue arise, legal action would not be the only concern. Matters of public opinion need to be considered with the potential to shut down a project entirely. Going back to what I said earlier about notoriety being a factor, it can be a double-edged sword. The less successful a project like this is, the more the public will criticize their efforts, and ultimately it can lead to the termination of a project. Who takes the first steps? Do the benefits outweigh the financial strain on these companies? And is it even practical to sacrifice human lives to do a job that a machine could potentially have done even more thoroughly? If we plan to send humans to Mars by the 30s, these are questions that we must have the answers to, as it's been made very clear that the first humans to journey to Mars will be making a one-way trip. Assuming we get past the initial steps, there are far greater challenges that come with maintaining such an enterprise. Should a successful colony of Mars begin to flourish and become independent, what type of relationship should we have with them? Should we govern them? Or should we let their own systems of government and society develop? What is the proper course of action should a dispute arise? If not handled correctly, it could result in the loss of our linchpin of research and development of extraterrestrial studies, as well as our most important hub for asteroid mining and other resources. Something even more concerning is the possibility for a disease outbreak. Upon arrival, the first settlers will be in a relatively sterile environment, with most of the microorganisms present being in the bacteria of their own digestive systems. Over a long period of time, due to isolation, the immune systems of those on Mars could deteriorate, as they'll come into contact with no new pathogens. This means travel to and from Earth would be volatile to the ecosystem of Mars. A virus that has mutated on Earth could be entirely harmless as the masses are vaccinated, but to those on Mars who have no way of defending themselves from it, it could be deadly. This means, once we create a colony of Mars, we either leave it to its own devices, or we commit to maintaining regular interactions and introduce different cultures of bacteria into that environment consistently. Even by the year 2050, maintaining that kind of a connection has its serious obstacles. Using current figures, it costs about $10,000 per pound for NASA to launch cargo into space. At that price, it would cost an extraordinary amount to send enough raw materials to build a settlement that's a fraction of the size of the Biosphere 2 experiment. Gases need to be sent in a condensed form and diffused upon arrival. Much like aboard the ISS, most of the oxygen will come from a process called electrolysis, which uses electricity from the ISS solar panels to split water into hydrogen and oxygen gas. The astronauts also need to be housed in a vessel that is resistant to radiation. At the moment, this is one of the factors delaying our first manned missions to Mars. The trip may be anywhere from 250 to 300 days, depending on how much fuel is taken to space. This is an issue because, at length, exposure to even a minor quantity of solar radiation will cause acute radiation syndrome. The same can be said for protecting astronauts on the surface of the red planet. Though there are some trace gases present at the surface, Mars is lacking a definite atmosphere. The key is to find a light, thin, and flexible material that is capable of deflecting harmful radiation, which can be used for both clothing and construction. Materials like these are currently under development, but the main limiting factor for materials such as carbon fiber clothing is cost. The crops sent to Mars must be genetically modified to be able to grow with far less photosynthetically active radiation, which is just another way of saying light that plants can use for photosynthesis. This can be tested by growing newly modified crops in dry climates that don't get much sunlight. The plants won't need to be modified to protect themselves against excess radiation, assuming they would be confined to artificial environments that also fit the living conditions for humans. Providing artificial light to grow plants is a less desirable approach because of the extra energy it would deplete. Creating plants that are independent in a new environment is more practical, even if it takes multiple generations before you have an adequate yield. Overall, it's tough to precisely evaluate, with the sheer amount of obstacles that space travel is tasked with. Though while entirely in the realm of possibility, with our current generation of aerospace technology, it's very unlikely for something of this scale to be carried out successfully. While we may not see a full-fledged colony on Mars in the near future, there are serious players in the industry who weren't there 40 years ago. With manned missions to Mars planned as early as the 2030s, it won't be long before this ambition becomes a reality. If you find this kind of material intriguing, I recommend checking out the game Surviving Mars. It's a game where you research and build your own settlement, all while balancing the energy and resources you have to make a thriving colony. It's also a fun way to learn more about the intricacies of creating an off-planet civilization, and just how much you have to stay on top of things to prevent them from going wrong. While I'm not sponsored to say this, I do genuinely enjoy these kinds of city-building games, and if you have an interest in sci-fi games, this one is definitely worth checking out.
Thanks for watching. If you have any feedback, leave it in the comments section and let me know what you'd like to have discussed in a future video.